for coming out to this important presentation on Acadian culture and history. The Acadian Archives at the University of Maine at Fort Kent is an important resource to our community on preserving Acadian culture, history, and language. I invite you to visit the Acadian Archives, and I'm sure that our director, Lise Peltier, will be more than happy to talk to you about the resources that we have there. Right now we have an Evangeline, an exhibit there in the Acadian Archives, and we are constantly involved in everything from meeting visiting scholars to individuals looking at genealogy, to students who are doing research, to just people who want to learn more about the Acadian Archives. Just not long ago, we were able to host Bike Maine in this area, and that group came to Fort Kent. They loved the St. John Valley. They were so appreciative of the hospitality here, and we had a reception for them at the Acadian Archives, where they were so impressed with the resources that we had there. So the Acadian Archives and preserving Acadian culture and history is so important to the mission of the campus, and we're so delighted to have tonight's presentation in support of that mission. This afternoon, to show you the importance of the topic to schools in our area, we were able to host 175 high school students, and Professor Faragher was so generous to talk to them. The high school students had worked with their teachers in terms of preparing, in terms of their own study of Acadian history. We're so appreciative in the St. John Valley of making this a part of the curriculum, and so they had been prepared about today's lecture and will be prepared for follow-up once they leave. We love this connection with UMFK, with our local schools, and with our community. Everything we do is about community. I'd like to make a selfless plug at this point and ask you to vote in the upcoming elections. We have signs for our students, and we certainly want to urge you to vote in the upcoming election. I'm not going to try to persuade you to vote for a particular candidate, but I am asking you to vote. And we have a question 4 on the ballot for the University of Maine system that asked, would you support the investment of $49 million for the University of Maine system? At UMFK, this will support a new building on Pleasant Street, a new enrollment and advancement center that will help us recruit more students, and again, make this more vital resource and show the investment on this campus. UMFK has a very strong nursing program, and over half of our majors are nursing majors. We're committed to meeting the needs of the state of Maine in nursing, in the other professions, in the other majors that we offer. And so as we face this nursing cliff, we're committed to graduating more BSNs and RNs to meet the needs not only in the St. John Valley, but in the entire state. So we hope that you will support question 4, that will help us here at UMFK with this new building, recruiting more students, and being even more of a vital asset to our region and to our state. With this, I want to thank Lise Peltier as our director of the Acadian Archives. I think she has been trying to persuade Professor to come here and speak for the last 5 years. He was actually he was able to come for 2 days, again, meet with high school students, and offer us a great resource for the high school students and for the campus and for the Acadian Archives and for the community. So we're so pleased. I want to thank Lise for her tireless efforts on behalf of the Acadian Archives. And for being responsible for our program tonight, and I will turn the program over to you, Lise, to introduce our speaker this evening.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Bonsoir. C'est vraiment beau de voir une salle pleine. It's wonderful to see a room full of people so interested by the work that is what I consider a gift to the people of the St. John Valley, and to us particularly, because we are the descendants of the survivors of what was called the deportation, a euphemism if ever there was one. And I am so proud of the fact that Dr. Faragher calls it what it is, ethnic cleansing. Dr. John Mag Faragher directs the Howard R. Lamar Center He is a professor of history and American studies, and he directs this research center. His areas of interest are the United States frontier and Western history, Native American borderlands, and Native American history. He was born in Phoenix, Arizona, in a big family, raised in Southern California, and he attended the University of California, did social work, and then went to Yale. He was a professor at Mount Holyoke College for 15 years, and then went to Yale in 1993. Some of his most famous books include Eternity Street, Violence and Justice in Frontier Los Angeles, A Great and Noble Scheme, The Tragic Story of the Expulsion of the French Acadians from their American homeland, and Daniel Boone, and Women and Higher Education in American History. Daniel Boone, for which you won an award, right? So I think Dr. Faragher here has demonstrated great generosity in meeting with students this afternoon, who I think were quite spellbound by not only what he had to say, but how he delivered the message as well. And I think you are in for a treat. I would like to thank, these events don't happen single-handedly. I would like to thank particularly Anne Chamberlain, my assistant in the archives. I also want to thank the people in PR, Carrie Watson Blaisdell, Sue Tardy, Aaron, for making this possible, and also making the live stream possible. The students from the Maine Science and Mathematics School could not make it this afternoon, and so they are actually with us tonight in this lecture. Dawn Raidman for graciously agreeing to film this presentation. Sodexo for a wonderful reception. President John Short and his wife Karen Cleveland Short, and everybody here who is attending. As I said, I strongly believe that this book in particular about Acadian history and about our ancestors is probably one of the greatest gifts that Dr. Faragher could give to us. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Faragher to come here and present.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight being here. I want to thank President John Short and his wife Karen Cleveland Short for their hospitality. And it's just been a delight meeting Lise and visiting the Acadian Archive. What energy and enthusiasm and passion. Invaluable. I'm sure you will all recognize that. And John talked last night at the President's house and just mentioned today the importance of community here. It's been clear to us that there is quite a community here. Really quite lucky about that. All right, I'm speaking tonight of the removal of the Acadians, ethnic cleansing in American history. When I spoke to the high school students this afternoon, I wanted to make sure that they paid attention to all parts of this title, the removal of the Acadians, the idea that this was ethnic cleansing, and more generally, how it fits into the broader patterns of American history. And I want to begin by reading a personal account of ethnic cleansing. It's a chilling account. It begins, families at dinner were startled by the sudden gleam of bayonets in the doorway and rose up to be driven with blows and oaths. Those are the words of a refugee. Men were seized in their fields Before going along the road, women were taken from their wheels and children from their play. Troops separated husbands, fathers and brothers from the women and children. In the chill of a drizzling rain, one of the soldiers remembered, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep. Many of these helpless people did not have blankets, and many of them had been driven from home barefooted. One can never forget the sadness and solemnity of that morning. The destruction of the houses and barns began immediately. In many cases on turning for one last look as they crossed the ridge toward a man who spoke to the refugees, they saw their homes in flames, fired by the lawless rabble that followed on the heels of the soldiers to loot and pillage. The scene was seared into memory. Looking back over a lengthy military career, one aged veteran who had participated as a perpetrator asserted, I have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew. That's right, the Cherokee removal. This is an account of the removal of the Cherokees from Georgia in 1837. When more than 15,000 Native people were forced from their homes by federal troops out of the state of Georgia and towards what would later be called Indian Territory. An estimated 4,000 refugees died along the way of exposure or disease. There are no contemporary images of the Cherokee removal, what the Cherokees themselves called the Trail of Tears. But this painting by the artist Robert Lindau, done in the 1940s, was based on considerable and meticulous historical research. Now, the accounts of the Cherokee Exodus echo the accounts of the Acadian removal, an operation that destroyed the homeland that Acadians had developed over more than a century and displaced some 17,000 people at the cost of an estimated 10,000 lives. And here is an image of the Acadian removal. Now, of course, there are no contemporary images of that either. This is before the era of documentary photography, of course. This is an image from an edition of Longfellow's Evangeline from 1867, done by the famous American illustrator F.O.C. Darley. And I want to give a plug here for the exhibit at the Acadian Archive of Evangeline material, which is very interesting and instructive. So, an account of the Acadian expulsion. Destroy all the villages, the British governor of Nova Scotia ordered, and use every other method to distress as much as can be those who may attempt to conceal themselves in the woods. A Yankee officer reported that he and his company surrounded a sleeping village before daybreak, surprising the Acadian families while they were still in their beds. Some men managed to escape into the woods, but most residents were captured. As the Massachusetts volunteers marched the women, children, and elderly inhabitants off, the scene was illuminated by the light of their burning homes. Troops scoured the countryside in search of fugitives. I'm afraid there will be some lives lost before they are got together, a British officer reported. You know our soldiers hate them, and if they can find a pretense to kill them, they will. Well, here's another image. This illustrates the account of Colonel John Winslow of Massachusetts who commanded colonial militia at the roundup of the Acadian community at the village of Grand Pré on Minas Basin. Winslow committed this vivid description to the pages of his diary. The inhabitants went off very solemnly and unwillingly, the women in great distress carrying their children in their arms, others carrying their decrepit parents, moving in great confusion, and it appeared a scene of woe and distress. In his diary, Winslow confessed his own distress. It hurts me to hear their weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. This is the worst piece of service yet ever I was in. The worst piece of service yet ever I was in. We heard the earlier account, the perpetrator write, the cruelest work I ever knew. Even hardened military veterans like these found their assignments abhorrent. That was because their operations were aimed at civilians, at families, women, children, the elderly, rounding them up and shipping them off. Both the Acadian and Cherokee removals were what we would today call ethnic cleansing. According to today's law of nations, such state-sponsored campaigns are classified as crimes against humanity. And the perpetrators, those who made the plans and those in charge of carrying them out, would be subject to indictment and trial at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. My book, A Great and Noble Scheme, The Tragic Story of the Expulsion of the French Acadians from their American homeland, recounts this history. The ethnic cleansing of the Acadian people by Massachusetts militia forces assisted by British troops. It was the first episode of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing in North American history. Now let's be clear. The colonization of North America by Spain, France, England, Holland, Russia, other European powers was accompanied by countless episodes of horrific violence against Native people, affecting tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of individuals. But the Acadian removal in 1755, 20 years before the American Revolution, was the first recorded instance of state actors, that is, civil and military officials in North America, planning and carrying out the kind of complicated logistical operation required to forcibly remove and relocate thousands of people, to lay waste to their homelands, and to sponsor the recolonization of the land by settlers of their own kind. Now, the title of my book is taken from a dispatch written by an anonymous correspondent, datelined Halifax, Nova Scotia, August 9th, 1755, and published in New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland newspapers. I want to read it to you. It's short, but it so clearly summarizes what ethnic cleansing is all about, in the words of the 18th century. We are now upon a great and noble scheme, the correspondent begins, of sending the neutral French, the Acadians, out of this province. They have always been secret enemies and have encouraged the savages to cut our throats. If we effect their expulsion, it will be one of the greatest things that ever the English did in America. For by all accounts, that part of the country they possess is as good land as any in the world. In case, therefore, we could get some good English farmers in their room, this province would abound with all kinds of provisions. The language here is 18th century, but the meaning is clear. The Acadians are allies of the Indians. They are our enemies, We will expel them, we will take their lands, which are very fertile, and put our own people in their place. That is the definition of ethnic cleansing. 7,000 Acadians were loaded onto ships and transported to other British North American colonies. 10,000 more fled into the woods and became refugees. They were divided and separated into smaller groups in an attempt to destroy their unity as a people. While only a few succeeded in returning to their old homeland, which was renamed Nova Scotia, they reconstituted themselves in a number of locations in New Brunswick and in Maine, as well as in Louisiana, where they became known as the Cajuns. The Acadian removal was the first episode of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing in North America. Regrettably, it was not the last, not by a long shot. In 1830, 75 years after what the Acadians called Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval, the Congress of the United States passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the federal government to assist states like Georgia in expelling Indian peoples from their ancient homelands and transporting them west of the Mississippi. We're looking at a copy, a working copy of that act in the Senate, Senate Bill 102, the 21st Congress, first session. In most cases, those homelands, those native homelands, had already been reduced to mere fragments through cessions of territory demanded by settlers, states, and the federal government. The list of Indian nations that experienced removal is a long one. The Cherokees suffered on their Trail of Tears in the 1830s. A quarter century later, in 1865, the Navajos endured what they called the Long Walk. And this is a very rare and very instructive photograph of the Long Walk in 1865. These Navajos are being driven from their homeland in what's now northern New Mexico and Arizona to southern New Mexico, to Bosco Redondo, which was essentially a concentration camp. But here we have now entered the era of documentary photography, so we have a photographic image of this removal. It's an amazing photograph. And here, just to give a sense of what I'm talking about, the various peoples who were removed, the list of them is very long. It includes the Apaches and the Arapahoes, the Cheyennes, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Comanches, and Creeks, the Delawares and the Iowas, the Kaskaskias, Kaws, Kickapoos, and Kiowas, the Omahas, the Osages, the Otos, and the Ottawas, the Pawnees, the Peorias, the Poncas, and the Potawatomis, the Sauks, the Seminoles, the Shawnees, the Winnebagos, and others. It's estimated that at least 200,000 native people suffered removal in the 19th century. Many of them suffered repeatedly as settlers crowded onto their reservation lands and demanded that the Indians relinquish even more. That's, of course, how Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma. These removals transferred most native land to the public domain of the United States to be distributed to settlers, states, and railroad companies. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was one of the most decisive political turns in the history of the nation. And I believe it must go down as one of the most shameful pieces of legislation ever passed by the United States Congress. The removal of the Cherokee people, carried out under the cover of the Indian Removal Act, received the most attention and generated the most controversy. Many Americans were opposed to it. Many were appalled by it. It shared many similarities with the Acadian removal of 8 decades before. In the first place, both operations, as I've argued, fit the modern understanding of ethnic cleansing, a concept that first entered the political discourse in the early 1990s, during the height of the ethnic violence in the former Balkan nation of Yugoslavia. And here, a photograph of Bosnian refugees taken in 1992. Yugoslavia, of course, had been a multicultural, multi-ethnic nation, but in the 90s it split into warring ethnic factions. And looking at this photograph, it's not too much, it doesn't take too much imagination to imagine that these might be the Navajos in 1865, or the Cherokees in 1838, or the Acadians in 1755. This is a portrait of the misery caused by removal. The year this photograph was taken, a United Nations Commission investigating the conflict in the Balkans provided the definition of what was happening. Ethnic cleansing, they agreed, was a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. The purpose is the occupation of territory to the exclusion of the excluded or purged group. This definition clearly fits both Acadian and Indian removal. The perpetrators and the beneficiaries of removal were driven by religious or racial prejudice. They assertively declared their own ethnic superiority, and they justified their criminal conduct with a militant ideology of expansion. These operations were not spontaneous uprisings. They were directed by state authorities, and they involved complicated logistical planning. Imagine you're going to deport 10,000 people on sailing vessels, each of which hold perhaps 200 people. It's a lot of sailing vessels. They have to be arranged for. They have to be manned. They have to be outfitted. They have to be supplied. You have to know where you're going. You have to take care of human problems like sanitation. You have to have a method of rounding them up. This is a complicated operation. This is not something that can happen spontaneously. It takes months and months of planning. Planning that was frequently botched, as it was in the Acadian case, as it was in the Cherokee case, as it was in the Navajo case, which cost literally hundreds of lives, a great deal of suffering and death among the victims. The lead up to both the Acadian and the Cherokee operations included threats of violence designed to terrorize and subdue target populations, as well as attempts to discredit and isolate local leaders. Again, this is from a Darley illustration from Evangeline. Acadian and Cherokee removal were characterized by very similar operational tactics, including the separation of men from the women and children, which we're witnessing in this illustration, employed as an effective means of coercing compliance. After the expulsion, both the Acadian and Cherokee homelands were repopulated in Nova Scotia by the so-called planters from southern New England, in Georgia by white settlers. The Acadian and Cherokee removals share another important feature. Both were aimed at societies that challenged the status quo and offered alternative paths to the future of North America. In the Cherokee case, an Indian people took seriously the national government's promise, embodied in solemn treaties, that it would recognize and protect their sovereignty and assist in their economic and political development. The Cherokees adopted commercial agriculture, in some cases including slave plantation agriculture. They developed their own writing system, which was learned and used by a majority of the people. They wrote a constitution, and they organized themselves into a democratic republican nation state. And here is the first published copy of that constitution. On the right side in the Cherokee syllabary, it's a phonetic language, a phonetic printed language. On the other side in English, yes, they too were bilingual people. Faced with the threat of expulsion by the combined force of the state of Georgia and the federal government, the Cherokees took the issue to court. They sued, arguing that their treaties, which have the force of law, protected them. The case was decided in the early 1830s by the Supreme Court. It recognized the Cherokees as a domestic dependent nation, with the right to make and enforce their own laws within their own territory, a right that neither the federal nor the state government of Georgia had any legal authority to prevent. But President Andrew Jackson, who took office in 1829, had made Indian removal his first priority. Jackson's popularity was largely based on his record as an Indian fighter. Here, a lithograph from his 1828 presidential campaign. He's not apologizing here. He fought the Cherokees, he defeated them, and he took their land. Much of the current states of Tennessee and Alabama were Cherokee land, Creek land. His own plantation was former Creek land, his plantation of the Hermitage in Tennessee. Jackson was infuriated by the ruling of the Supreme Court, and he infamously ignored it. Yes, working out the relations between different levels of sovereignty, the federal government, the states, and also Indian nations, which is what we have today, by the way, would have been complicated, but it was not inconceivable. The Supreme Court said it had to be done. But with the wholesale adoption of Indian removal as national policy, the nation turned in a different direction. Like the Cherokees, the Acadians also took a different path. They practiced a particular kind of colonialism, planting communities in the homeland of another people, the Mi'kmaq, in a manner that was more about accommodation than conflict. Of course, there are the famous dikes on the Bay of Fundy, reclaiming land from the sea rather than taking it from the native people. We can both win here, they said. Here are some 18th century images of Mi'kmaq, a man and a woman, although they're labeled Acadian, these are actually native people. During the first and second generations of French settlement in Acadie, there was a good deal of intermarriage between settlers and indigenous people. That practice declined once the Acadians had established their community, but both settler and native peoples continued to recognize kinship across communal lines. The Acadians looked at the neighboring Mi'kmaq people and they did not see alien others, they saw cousins. Distant cousins, perhaps, but cousins nonetheless. Settlers and natives went to the same Catholic chapels, they were confessed by the same priests, They had their names recorded in the same baptismal and marriage registers. They acknowledged a cultural and Christian kinship that bridged their two communities. What's more, the Acadians adopted a different way of dealing with empire. Acadia had originally been a French colony, but in 1710 it was captured by the armed forces of Great Britain. The British wanted the Acadians to sign a loyalty oath, and they eventually did, but only after the British agreed to include a clause that exempted the Acadians from taking up arms against the French or the Mi'kmaq. The Acadians diligently maintained that neutrality in the ongoing imperial struggle between Great Britain and France. In fact, they were often called the French neutrals. They thrived under the protection of their neutrality, and they held steady to their position. This was something that imperial authorities and settlers in New England had a great difficulty accepting. From the beginning, New Englanders had fought the Indians and taken their lands. It was precisely because of the Acadians' ability to get along with Native people and their refusal to take sides in the destructive imperial wars that they were crushed. That is what makes the Acadian story, to me, so sad. Both the Acadians and the Cherokees offer historic examples of concepts and practices about diversity, tolerance, equal rights, and justice from which we can learn today. To me, the story of their struggles is inspiring yet tragic. Tragic because it was precisely those admirable concepts and practices that led to their destruction. Now, there's another important way in which the Acadian and the Cherokee cases are linked historically together. In 1830, as the Congress of the United States was debating the Indian Removal Act, the North American Review, the nation's premier literary journal, published two important essays. One is here, The Removal of the Indians. This is an essay by a Democratic supporter, a Democratic Party supporter of President Jackson. And here, an essay taken from Thomas Chandler Halliburton's newly published History of Nova Scotia. It's a long essay on the removal of the Acadians. Now, before this publication, before this excerpt in the North American Review, the Acadian story was not widely known in the United States. I've tried to track down what people did know about it in the years before 1830, and it seems to be very little. But that was about to change. Newspapers in every section of the country published excerpts from the Halliburton essay in the North American Review. The Acadian removal, one editor opined, was one of cold-blooded and deliberate tyranny, which would have added disgrace to the character of a Nehru. Other editors issued similar expressions of horror. But even more interesting was the fact that the story of Acadian removal became a touchstone for the debate over the Cherokees. The expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia by the British, who was correspondent to the New York American. Here we see the front page, and that article is right there on the front page. I've blown it up so you can see it. It says, to the editor, Mr. Editor, but this is the way they did in those days. This is not a letter to the editor. This is a correspondent for the paper submitting an article. The expulsion, history, wrote the editor of an evangelical Christian magazine, presents us with a most affecting picture of the sufferings of the Acadians, who were barbarously expelled from Nova Scotia. We should think that every man who read this article would find it impossible to sympathize with the cold-blooded vindication of the cruel and inhuman project for the removal of the Indians. So, reading about Acadian removal makes me think again about whether removal is a good policy. Acadian removal even found its way into the congressional debate. I should be very sorry, declared a representative from New York on the floor of the House of Representatives, that we should be forced to confess that we have made no advance in the morality of the code of public law by which enlightened nations are willing to be governed. I hope that our society has gone forwards, not backwards. We boast much of our improvement in other things. Why should we not be willing to admit it in this? I cannot consent to take the expulsion of the French from Acadie as a fit model to illustrate our duties to the Cherokees. The congressional debate was long and bitter and intense, but in the end, the Indian Removal Act passed by a bare majority. At a large public meeting in New York City protesting the vote, a speaker denounced what he characterized as the cruelty of the law, which, he declared, surpassed Roman tyranny or even the conduct of the British toward the poor Acadians. Now, there's an extremely interesting story here about the way in which 19th century Americans considered the meaning that the history of Acadian removal had for their own time. But one thing to note here is the way that most Americans held the British, rather than Americans themselves, responsible for the Acadian removal. Now, it's true that the operation was commanded by British officials and officers. But they did so in full collaboration with the political leaders of the colony of Massachusetts. The great majority of officers and men who perpetrated the deed were Yankees. The ships in which the Acadians were deported all came from Boston. The planters who recolonized Acadian lands were all from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They were all Yankees. The refusal of Americans to accept historical responsibility for Acadian removal had consequences. A Georgia newspaper editor, a fervent supporter of the removal of the Cherokees from the state, contrasted what he termed the kindness and liberality of American policy toward Indian people with the horrible treatment of the Acadians, which he attributed entirely to the British. The cold-blooded cruelty exercised toward that unfortunate people, he wrote, is as much beyond anything on record in our history with respect to the Indians as can be imagined. Now, in other words, the British did it, we're exonerated. We don't have to learn from that lesson. That perspective was common. In 1841, a New England woman named Catherine Reed Williams published the first comprehensive history of the Acadian atrocity. Note the neutral French. This is what the common name for the Acadian people. She contrasted the Acadian removal operation with what she termed the late arrangements for removing the Indians to the west by the government of the United States. Now, Mrs. Williams was unsure of the wisdom of Jackson's policy. She was a Whig, and Jackson was a Democrat. Nevertheless, she was convinced that the authorities were conducting it in the most humane way possible. It was thought, she wrote, that unless some plan could be contrived to preserve them as a people, the Indians must inevitably be extinct in a few centuries. And this, of course, was the argument. We're protecting them by removing them. This is the kind of protection that mobsters sold in Chicago. If you don't want your store bombed, pay me. All the native people who were removed, she claimed, had been compensated for their property, protected by troops during their immigration, and settled on fertile lands in the West. Unfortunately, that's an assessment that is completely contradicted by the historical evidence. Contrast Indian removal, she wrote, with Acadian removal. The barbarity of driving out an innocent and unoffending people with fire and sword from their dearly earned possessions. So then, who was responsible? Although Mrs. Williams acknowledged that the operation had been carried out by Yankee militiamen from Massachusetts, ultimately, she argued, the blame was the British. They did what was done, she concluded, by the authority of the English king. Her perspective was readily adopted by other Americans. We had no conception of the gross wrongs and outrages to which the early French colony had been subjected, wrote a reviewer of Williams's book. We could only say, while reading it, thank God we do not have a drop of English blood in our veins. Or if we did, we should blush and hang our heads and never speak again of our glorious ancestors. Well, that was also the view of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose epic poem, Evangeline, first published in 1847. Here, the edition from 1867 that was illustrated by Darley. I showed you some of those illustrations before. Evangeline popularized the Acadian story. But Longfellow blamed the horror entirely on the British. Through Evangeline, one of the most popular books of the 19th century, Acadian removal would continue to be used as an analog to Indian removal. After the Civil War, when the citizens of California were debating what to do with their own indigenous Indian communities, many of them advocated removal to Indian territory. Others protested. An editor of a Sacramento newspaper condemned the plan to remove them to some distant reservation as a separation as hopeless as the barbarous removal by the British of the Acadian farmers immortalized by Longfellow in Evangeline. The refusal to accept historical responsibility for Acadian removal left Americans in the dark, willfully ignorant of the troubling and enduring patterns in our history. Our young people do not fully understand the enormity of the crime which was committed against a helpless race, wrote John G. Burnett many years after his service as an infantry company enforcing Cherokee removal. The truth is, he continued, the facts are being concealed from young people today. They do not know that we are living on lands that were taken from a helpless race at the bayonet point to satisfy the white man's greed. In other words, if we fail to tell the truth about history, we are fated to make the same moral blunders that were made in the past. This man's comment was as true of Acadia as it was of Cherokee removal, and it remains as true today as it was then. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions. In fact, I'm eager to take questions. Yes, sir.
During the arrest, the men were separated from the women and children. Was there any attempt ever made to reunite them before they put them on the ship, as that picture seems to indicate?
So the question is, the men were separated from their families, and the second part was?
Was an attempt made to reunite them before they put them back on the ships, or put them on the ships to leave?
There were some attempts. Often here we have a famous painting by Claude Picard of the moment of the land of the boarding, and this is at Grand Pré. And in fact, I would actually, I think the better depiction is here. I think this is much more likely, I mean, this is exaggerated to be sure, but nevertheless, this is much more conveys the sense that one gets reading the primary sources. Not the calm scene, but this turmoil. Now, in the midst of this kind of turmoil, again, consider the responsibility. You're an officer, you're a perpetrator, you've got the men over here and the women over there, and you're loading the women, and then the men are saying, but those are my family. I can't go on that ship, I gotta go on this one. And there were soldiers who testified, I did my best, but their best wasn't always the best. So families were separated at the boarding, and if we think about what's happening here, this pattern, and just I'm sure you know, so here's Nova Scotia, and these arrows represent the various destinations of the deportees to Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. People found themselves in Massachusetts with their family in the Carolinas. Very typical. And so you get the aftermath of removal, you get people, Acadian people in the colonies publishing in the newspaper, has anybody seen my husband? Some of these families never reunited. This is the consequence of that kind of, because once people left here, the perpetrators didn't care. They had made no arrangements. None of these colonies knew these people were coming. The ships just showed up. They had no advance notice at all. They had made no preparation. The Acadians were unloaded and dumped. In some cases, in Georgia, Virginia, they never even were allowed off the ships. They languished on the ships. Eventually, the ships were sent to England, and the Acadians were imprisoned in English warehouses in the docks of English ports, and then eventually deported to France. So, no, it was a horrendous operation. The separation of the sexes, which is a standard feature of almost every case of ethnic cleansing, takes place in my historical judgment for the first time in the Acadian movement, because it's a very effective way of enforcing compliance to separate the families and make sure that they obey the commands. Yes, sir.
Professor, I was curious about the geographic approach of the military. Did they have some systematic approach working their way down the Grand Prix? Did you get any sense of that in your literature review?
I'm not sure I understand.
So in other words, when they came into Nova Scotia, what was their geographic approach to the landscape? Did they start in one village and work kind of northeast?
The perpetrators.
Yes, yeah, the Yankees. And what is that time frame too? I was curious of that.
As I had said before, the plans for the operation had been made over a year before. They had sat on the shelf for quite some number of months, and they had been planned out meticulously by the surveyor, the official surveyor of the province of Nova Scotia, who was a Yankee, a good friend of the governor of Massachusetts, Charles Morris, and he planned it out meticulously, all the communities, all the sites, all the ports, how many ships they would require. This was before the war, the 7 Years' War began, which of course the Acadian expulsion is in some way the very first feature of that war. It's the first event of that war. So they had the plan on the shelf, and they waited until the war started, and then they put it into operation. And as I said, all the ships were contracted in Boston, and they were given instructions. You go here, you go there. But it was, they showed up at these places with, of course, no notice. The ships showed up, and the troops got off, and they began to round up the people. It was one of those horrific...
So multiple fronts.
That's right.
That's
right.
Oh, I just wanted, because you were talking about separation of family. Antonin Maillet, who is probably the most famous of Acadian authors, blends history and oral history in her books. And she talks about people who became those who unearthed the roots of families. Because when people had been separated from their families for 10, 15 years, children were growing up and becoming of marriageable age. They would find a Catholic French person that could be his or her cousin without them knowing at all, because they had been separated for more than a decade. And so they would go to this person and they would try to unearth their roots and try to find a common ancestor or not, to see if they could marry. And that tradition continued well after the Acadians either resettled in Acadia, that was no longer Acadia, but they still call Acadia, and is still very alive in the historical fictions of today.
I saw some other hands. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit about the deportation from East St. John or Prince Edward Island, as well as the fact that the diaspora goes all the way down into the Caribbean. I mean, I think, of course, the famous example of the Governor General of Canada, Michaëlle Jean, who finds out she has an Acadian ancestor. So, yeah, just wondering if you might be able to
Okay, so many people, the principal spots of the removal would be here along the Bay of Fundy, Bay Francais. And many people fled across to Ile Saint-Jean, PEI now. And there was, 2 years later, there was a second removal of the refugees who had found their way to the island. And if these removals were horrific, this was even worse. The conditions on these ships was intolerable. And these were large vessels brought in by the British. This was a military operation. In this operation, it was really the British who were in charge. And one of these ships went down in the Atlantic. I mean, it took about 500 people with it. And then they went, these people were all deported directly to France. Of course, these Acadians, their only connection to France was that they spoke French and they had ancestors who, 4 generations or 5 generations before had come to France. So they were not happy in France. Now, in the whole diaspora of Acadians in the wider Atlantic world, this is just a detail from the poster. This is a fantastic poster. I urge you, if you don't have this and you're interested in the Acadian history, this is a wonderful poster to have. There's a copy at the Acadian Archive, and you can purchase this from Parks Canada.
We sell it.
And you sell it, okay. So if you see the whole poster, it goes through the whole diaspora. And there were Acadians who ended up in the Falklands, in the South Atlantic. There were Acadians in Haiti. And of course, eventually, famously, they went to Louisiana Now, this was some 20, 25 years after the original removal. And most of the folks who ended up in Louisiana had spent many years in France before. So they tended to be the people who had first fled to Ile Saint-Jean, then gone to France, and then eventually ended up in Louisiana. But it's an amazing story altogether. And there have been, besides my book, there are other books that have been written more recently that talk about that diaspora and the wide range and the effects that it had in transforming Acadian culture and the interesting ways in which Acadians continued to hold together. And nevertheless, I've heard over the years many, many stories about the way, particularly now that there are the occasions of the World Acadian Congress that meets every 5 years, and which has brought Acadians from the Maritimes and Maine and Louisiana together, in many cases for the first time. People are discovering, well, they have different traditions, but then they have this common tradition which goes back to the 18th century and still is vital. So really quite an amazing story. Yes, sir.
What's your take on how our ancestors got up to Fort Kent, Maine?
Up here. I think many, Lise would be a lot better source on this than me, but many folks fled to the St. John River area in 1755. In fact, there one famous ship, the Pembroke, the exiles on board ship mutinied, took over the ship and scuttled it at the mouth of the St. John's River, and then went upriver trying to get to Quebec. So the Acadians were very familiar with the St. John's River. The Acadian history in the early years has a lot to do with the Rivière St. Jean, and so they were not unfamiliar with it. But eventually, quite a number of people settled on the lower St. John River, the lower St. John's Valley. But after the Revolution, the American Revolution, many Tories came to New Brunswick to settle, including the family of John Winslow, the colonel who had removed the Acadians from Grand Pre. Now, Winslow himself had died in 1775. He wasn't able to be a Tory in the Revolution. He died too soon. But his nephew was a leading Tory, Edmund, I think it was Edwin, maybe it's Edward Winslow. And so they settled the lower St. John River Valley and expelled the Acadians who were there. And those people then moved upriver to the Madawaska area. And I believe those were some of the first Acadian settlers in this part of the country. I think there were plenty of Acadians who ended up along the St. Lawrence, in Quebecois communities, and there was a migration from there south into the St. John Valley. So this is all, the settlement here was all a product of the removal, refugees and exiles trying to find a place to remake their cultural home. Yes, sir.
How many major hubs are there for Acadians, like the ones here?
How many?
Like how many major hubs where there's like a lot of Acadians together where the culture is very defined?
Major hubs, I'm not sure what that...
Like, you know how there's Acadia here and then like places that the Acadian Congress comes from. How many are there? There are quite a few or just a couple?
Well, I think they, if we just listed it up by states and provinces, it would be Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Quebec, Maine, and Louisiana. Of course, Cajun Louisiana extends almost all the way to Houston. So you probably got to include East Texas too. There are Acadians all over. Yes, ma'am.
How did they ever name the province Nova Scotia? How did that come about? La Nouvelle-Écosse, that's Scotland.
In the early 17th century, 1620s, when the Acadians were just in the process of establishing their settlements in the Maritimes, and they had settlements along the St. John's River, and they had settlements along the Bay of Fundy, and on the Rivière Dauphine, the Annapolis River. The British were always, they always considered this French presence here to be illegal. Actually, it reminds me of an interesting little fact. I think I have it in my book. When one of the French parties in these early years, they were all fur traders. This was actually before they developed their dike farming system, which comes about, I think, around the middle of the 17th century, about 1650s or so. But so this is before that. So I think it may be Charles Latour or someone like that's talking about going on a fur trading expedition to the south from his base and what is that, the coast of Maine. And he said, we went to coast, we took off to explore the shores of Florida. I think, what does that mean? Florida? Well, the Spanish named the coast of North America Florida. And by saying that he was going to Florida, he was just writing out the English settlements in New England. He was just blanking them out of his consciousness. They didn't exist. There was the French, and then there was the border, and then there was Florida. And the English were there. The English felt the same way. The English had claimed everything from Florida all the way to the North Pole along the coast of the Western Atlantic. So in the 1620s, the English sent a very small force to what was Port Royal, which is now Annapolis Royal, and a small force, an armed force, and they took it over. And they were Scots settlers. And actually, the guy that was very influential here was a Scotsman who had actually been involved in writing the King James Version of the Bible. They were, militant Protestants, and they called their colony Nova Scotia, New Scotland. And so to the English, the British, this established their claim. This was their claim. So they considered the French, the Acadians, just be interlopers. They had no legitimate right to be there. So from the British perspective, at least the ideology that they pushed, their public relations strategy was to say the French should never have been here, they weren't allowed here, so removing them is just eliminating a problem that should never have happened in the first place. It's always been Nova Scotia. Of course, that was 150 years later, 4 or 5 generations later, but never mind. Another day. Yes, sir.
What's your connection? I mean, Faragher isn't an Acadian name.
No, I don't think so. Although I will say that if you dig into Acadian history, particularly in that early period, not the 18th century, not the British conquered Acadian in 1710 again, and then the Acadians lived under British rule from 1710 until they expelled them in 1755. In the period before that, in the late 17th century, when France and Britain were fighting over the colony, and there was very little new immigration of French settlers into Acadie, the Acadians did everything they could to convince sailors and merchants, people who would stop in to trade, to stay, because they needed men to marry their daughters. I mean, Lisa's talking about the cross-cousin marriage problem. You got to avoid but they got all kinds of, in those years, they got all kinds of dispensations from their priests allowing them to marry cousins because it was so difficult. And so there could have been a Faragher in there. There were other English names. And you know, if you read my book, there are some fascinating stories. A lot of Huguenots came to Acadia and secretly practiced their Protestant religion. And some of the leading Acadians secretly were Protestant. And this leads me to think, and I think other historians as well, to think that their commitment to Catholicism was relatively thin. You know, now that may seem strange to you because, I mean, since most of you here are descendants of Acadians, I'm sure that the more immediate ancestors were very devout Catholics, and that intense Catholicism was really a product of the post-removal generations of Acadians. If you read the accounts of people going to Acadian before the removal, they're all talking about how secular the people are, how much, you know, they're good time kind of people. And the priests are writing all the time, these Acadians are terrible. I can't control them at all. But the particular story of my own interest is that our daughter, we have 3 kids, and our middle child is a daughter. In the 1990s, she was attending graduate school in Louisiana. And my wife and I, Michelle and I, went down to visit her. This is, I think, about 1995. And we went to, we were there on a Sunday. It was a beautiful day. We drove down Bayou Teche. We ended up at Evangeline State Park, a beautiful little park there. And there's a reconstructed Cajun cabin there, at least there was then. And we went in, and this poster was on the wall. And I fell in love with this poster. And I couldn't tear myself away from it. And because I had read Evangeline as a junior in high school. In those years, you had to memorize the thing. And of course, the only thing anybody ever remembers is this is the forest primeval. That's about the only thing I remember of the poem. But so I knew the Evangeline story, but I didn't know the real history. And so I bought a little book at the bookstore there about the Acadian removal, written by a historian, Louisiana historian, Carl Bresso. Excellent historian, wonderful man, very dear friend of ours now. And read that and just then was unable to get it out of my head. Somebody said today, out of my heart. So the interesting conclusion to that little tale is that our daughter then went on and married a Cajun. And so I have 2 Oquan grandsons now.
Yes, sir. Professor, I'm just wondering, the questions have been wonderful and I appreciate it. I'm just wondering if our guests at the main School of Science and Math might have questions as well. Is that enough?
How to do that?
Just ask them.
Well, I'm going to ask if the remote audience has a question, and I'd be happy to.
And I'll make them appear for us.
Take that.
Oh my God.
Any questions from our friends on the internet?
Wondering if you have any other recommendations for books in addition to yours that students might read to learn more about the piece.
Recommendation for other readings?
Yeah.
Is that what the
In addition
question?
to your, do you have other sources?
Well, you should definitely start with my book. That's definitely. The historian I just mentioned, Carl Bresso, I would highly recommend his work. He's written many works. In fact, his son, Ryan Bresso, then attended Yale University, was one of my students, one of my graduate students, and is now about to publish a book on the Acadian diaspora. So looking at the history of Cajuns, Acadians in Maine, New Brunswick, and in Nova Scotia and Quebec, and their history of separation, and then they're coming back together through the era of the Acadian Congrès. So look at books by Brasso, B-R-A-S-S-E-A-U-X, Carl and Ryan Brasso. In fact, Carl and Ryan Brasso wrote a wonderful book about Cajun Acadian cuisine, which is really a great read. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about how you see how you interpret the Acadians' deportation in the context of the French-English rivalry throughout North America. We know that just a few years later there was the battle on the Plains of Abraham, and the English conquered Quebec, and New France was basically history. And this was when I was a school boy. It was a long time ago. John Martin remembers, but so it was a long time. We learned about the French and Indian War. So, what's the context of the deportation in that?
Okay. Well, as I mentioned in a previous answer, the Acadian expulsion was really part of the first act of that war. The war really, when we talk about the 7 Years' War, what the Americans called the French and Indian War, it often focuses on developments in and around Pittsburgh. Washington, who was a militia captain for Virginia, led a force in to try to defeat the encroaching French, and so there was a big theater of action in what we now think of as the middle colonies, but the actual first real geostrategic incidents of the war happened here. When the British invaded Canada, or in New France, and finally won the war on the Plains of Abraham, that military operation also extended down on the south bank of the St. Lawrence and further down. So many of the people were affected by that fighting, which was brutal fighting. These were all these guys were under the command of James Wolfe, the British Brigadier General, and his forces were trained in a particularly brutal style of warfare. That they took the fight to villages. They didn't deport people; they killed them. And there were quite a number of Acadians who were involved in those campaigns, who were swept up in Wolfe's raids along the southern margin of the St. Lawrence Valley. There was some terrible, terrible things happened there, and the Acadians were very much affected by that. Interestingly, when the British won the war, the first thing they thought they were going to do was do to the Canadians the same thing they had done to the Acadians. They were going to remove them. And then they started counting them. And they realized they did not have the capacity to deport 70,000 people. Now I think so here we're only 10 years out, really, from Acadian removal. We're in 1763, 1764. And the British are already now having second thoughts about what they did. Both the practical significance of what they did, because, I'll give you an example. The planters came into Nova Scotia. The planters were from Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. They came into Nova Scotia. They took over the Acadian farms. It's a problem. They didn't know how to operate the dikes. And they take constant maintenance. Constant maintenance. And, the tides on the upper Bay of Fundy are 50-foot tidal variation. And you've got to maintain those dikes. And so if you don't, of course, the salt water creeps in, and the land becomes saline, and you can't grow anything. So what did they do? They brought Acadians back and hired them as managers of their farms. So I think people are now working as wage laborers on farms that they were once their own farms. It doesn't get any worse than that. But those kinds of things, and by that point in the 1760s, there were prominent British politicians who were saying, we made a terrible mistake. And not only that, we made a terrible moral mistake. What we did was morally indefensible. And so there were actually people in England making that argument by the 1760s. So when it came to handling the people of New France, the Quebecois, the British just they made a turn. They eventually granted religious toleration and for Catholics, and allowed, in England, Catholics were not allowed to vote or hold office, to take oaths, to swear in court. It was an anti-Catholic culture, and they had to really do a 180-degree turn and allow these things to happen in Canada, in British North America. And of course, this is what, now we're moving on to the American Revolution, and this was what the American revolutionaries called one of the intolerable acts. The tolerance for Catholicism in Canada was one of the intolerable acts. It was one of the things that they put on their agenda. This is why we've got to overthrow the British. We can't allow this kind of toleration. Go figure. It's a very strange world. Are we done here? No way.
I think so. I think this could go on forever because it's fascinating. The first thing I want to do is thank Dr. Faragher for his book, first of all, but also for agreeing to come here. I have to tell you that I've been researching and involved in Acadian life, history, and people for a very long time, and your lecture brought tears to my eyes. So thank you very much. I want you to look at this.
This is the poster.
It's a new one.
Oh, it's a new one.
Yes. So this is a great poster because as Acadians have called this time not only the forced removal of their people, but the great upheaval, a period of time that lasted 100 years.
Oh, look at the back of it.
So
double-sided?
Yes, in French and in English, because it's made in Canada, see? On est bilingue. So the top part explains the exile, that is the forced removal, and the bottom part is afterwards, where Acadians went on their own after they were allowed to, which is after 1763. So the rest of the items are a book of history of the St. John Valley by Dr. Beatrice Craig that is called The Land in Between.
Beautiful.
I mentioned what that means, the land in between. And what we saw. We were lucky enough to see 3 on the road. Yes. And of course, who can come to the St. John Valley? And a number of other things, among which a recipe book. Noise. and of course the Acadian flag.
Oh, wonderful.
So thank you
basket.
very, very much.
And the basket.
Oh, the basket, yes, potato picking. A potato picking basket, not quite exactly as I remember it. Actually, mine were quite a bit bigger. That's where I broke my hip. But these are made by Maliseet even today. You can buy them from Tobic, for sure. Janice, I'm not sure where you get them, but they do make them. I've bought some from the Maliseet Nation of Tobic. So thank you very, very much for coming. Any last questions?
I notice on the map, there's an arrow going across the Atlantic, I
Yeah.
suppose, back to France, where some of them...
This arrow here represents the people who were taken to Virginia, to Georgia, and were immediately then sent to England because those colonies didn't know they were coming, didn't want them, and didn't even let them get off the ships.
They were
I thought
sent to
they
prison.
sent them back to France, and I thought, who brought them there? Not the British. Now I get it, thank you.
Why did it take the Queen 250 years to apologize?
First of all, she did not apologize.
No.
She did not apologize. There's no apology from the Queen, and she will not apologize. She acknowledged the historical accuracy of the accounts of the forced exiles and everything that was that happened throughout the years, because these lasted quite a few years. She wasn't why the Queen's going to apologize.
I'm not saying anything to that.